Well, hello and good morning to you. It's wonderful to be speaking to you at the St Mary's Harvest Festival. And the past 9 months or so have reminded us that there are going to be times when we need to trust not in ourselves and our own strength, but to trust in God's provision. There are going to be loads of people who benefit directly from what has been given by so many of you, which at this time, when so many are facing the prospect of losing livelihoods, could be a vital lifeline. And in giving, we are being God's hands and feet in the world at a time when it's so desperately needed. So, a big thank you to all of you. But trusting in God's provision is something that we all need to remember, and we might be guilty of, I think, in the modern world, we might be a little bit guilty of forgetting about from time to time. You see, for me, it's all too easy to go to a shop and buy exactly what I need, to just have it there on a shelf. And I forget that where that item on the shelf has actually come from, the process that it's taken from the ground on a farm somewhere through perhaps a long process to end up on that shelf. And we run the risk as a species of thinking that sometimes the world purely exists for our own demands, and that as long as we've got the money to buy whatever it is we want, that we can just have it like that. And when we forget where our food and where those things that are provided for by God to us, where those things come from. And in doing so, we can run the risk of not really caring for the world in a way that we should do. And actually, one of the commands that's given to us in Genesis is to steward the world well, to have a good connection with nature, with the animals, and with the plant life that God has so generously and abundantly provided for us. But these days, our connection with the natural world within God's creation and how it actually provides for us has been in danger of being eroded over many years. We are losing that connection in many respects, and we are losing it to our peril. I was recently watching the latest documentary by the legendary filmmaker Sir David Attenborough, which is a startling jolt into the reality of our present situation. I do highly recommend it uh, as a documentary. It's not got the most wonderful title. It's called Extinction, um, but I do highly recommend it. And within that, he highlights many of the dangers that we are facing in the natural world at the moment. We are in danger of losing many of our treasured species on the planet through the misuse of our land and through the misuse of those animals. In northern Africa, there are just two white rhinos left. They are the last of their kind. And even more sadly, they are mother and daughter. So the reality is that once they pass, we will no longer have that particular species on our planet, as there's no mates left for them to reproduce. And as a species ourselves, we are exposing ourselves to the risk of more viruses emerging through encroaching on wildlife habitats that are really best left alone. And furthermore, at the hands of climate change, we are endangering ourselves and our own future place on the world and on this planet through changing the composition of air quality and speeding up the warming on our planet to the point where it just can't cope anymore, and habitats can't cope with that change. But within all of this was a message of hope as well. And I was just as startled to learn how fast our planet can recover if we give it a chance. God's provision just isn't in the immediate foods that we eat, but also in the way in which the world itself has been designed. There is grace and mercy within God's design, and wild habitats can spring back into life in an amazingly quick fashion, and they can become places of abundance once more. And personally, I was amazed this spring and this summer at just how quickly wildlife suddenly seemed to appear in a drastic way, with a reduced level of activity from ourselves. Through watching the birds and seeing things like foxes, creatures like foxes become just more noticeable um, this year in comparison to some of the previous years was one way I noticed the difference. And perhaps it was just another reminder that our actions do count. And perhaps the message there is that we have been going the wrong way for some time. And as the people of God, what we do and how we live is important to the Lord. And it is out of obedience to his commands that comes the blessings. And that's the message in Deuteronomy's reading this morning, which is an interesting one. And I have heard this used in the prosperity gospel in interesting ways, in ways that I wouldn't see as healthy. Some preachers seem to have seen this as a recipe for getting what we want in life. You know, if you just do this, God will give you blessing, and then you can just have that, and it's for yourself. And I don't think that's the way we're meant to interpret this morning's reading. You know, it's not like these blessings are bad things. They're not. They are wonderful things. They are terrific things. And, you know, let's be real for them a moment. They're called blessings for a reason. They are a good thing to have. But we cannot lose sight of the manner in which they are given to us. These are blessings and they are a gift from God, not through a mechanical process of simply do this and I'll give you stuff in return. You know, it's not rewards for good work in one sense. They are blessings of grace built that come through relationship and obedience to how he has asked us to live. It's through relationship with God that these blessings come. We don't simply do these as rewards for ourselves. Uh, you know, that they are blessings, but they are not a reward for our own gain. They are blessings so that we can in turn be a blessing. It's relationship with God and relationship with others. And that's the way God is asking us to live. Well, as I mentioned earlier, one of the very first commands that God gives us in Genesis is to look after creation well, to steward it well. In other parts of the Old Testament, and amongst other things, the Israelites are told to be generous to the poor, to live well with one another, to treat the alien in the land well, and to be generous with what they have. Their blessing from God and their elevated status through relationship with God doesn't come purely for their own gain. They are called to be a blessing. They are given those blessings so that they can bless the world around them. And that's how they become prosperous. And when we start to think about what this actually means in our lives today, we realize that we are given things, that we are out of the abundance of what gives us, we are to give to those around us. There's also obviously the famous story in the Gospels of the young boy who simply has two loaves of fish, two pieces of fish and 5 loaves of bread, and he simply gives that to God, and God uses it to bless others around them. We realize that our provision is not simply dependent on what we do to provide for ourselves, but on God's hand upon our lives. And we need to learn that what we do with what God gives us counts. It's one of the mistakes that the rich fool makes in the parable that Jesus tells in the reading from Luke's Gospel this morning. The rich fool seems to think that he can become self-sufficient. He has this abundant land that produces more crops than he can store. And rather than doing something good with it, and sharing it out and thinking, actually, out of the abundance I could give. He builds a bigger barn to store it and keeps it for himself. But if he knew what it was to be rich towards God, he would have known what to do with what he had. He should have known that out of that abundance, he should have been generous. He should have fed those without food. He should have respected the fact that God had given to him, that he might be able to give. God calls us not to worry about our own gain. And that's the meaning behind Luke's what Jesus says in Luke's gospel this morning. And that "do not worry" that comes in the next bit of the passage has that sense of not worrying about our gain. You see, in those times, the best people, in the view of many, ate the most expensive foods and they wore the best clothes. But Jesus warns that that's what the pagan world chases after. They chase after more for themselves. And in some respects, the Jewish people had begun to chase after those things rather than remembering who it was that God had called them to be. Jesus' simple instruction to his followers was not to worry about such things, but to remember who God is and what he does for us. Jesus is interested about what's going on in our heart, and not about a lavish lifestyle that's lived on the outside. Once more, it's about that relationship we have with God, and that being the lens that gives us the view to the world around us. When we view things through God's eyes, we see the world differently. When we view the world through God's eyes and remember his commands to us, we remember that we were created and placed within creation as stewards. We are here for the good of the land and for the good of one another. In 2020, the danger of becoming a rich fool is perhaps a little too close for comfort. I was shocked, angered, and saddened viewing a recent news article that showed tons of food being thrown away because it was not deemed perfect enough for sale through some of the big supermarkets. And there wasn't actually anything wrong with any of it. Many of the items just didn't look that aesthetically pleasing to the eye. You know, a carrot was slightly wonky, or in one case, the broccoli was slightly too big. We have access to all this abundance in our society, yet we store up what we think we can use and throw away what we can't, while so many in our world go hungry. And we have to ask ourselves, as a society, is this the way to God's blessing? And once more, in that documentary I mentioned earlier, David Attenborough expanded on this, saying that if we just used what we actually grew and didn't throw as much of it away, the land that we saved from not having to use it for agriculture would go a long, long way to solving elements of the climate and extinction crisis that we are facing. I was shocked to learn of something that some Chinese farmers learned a few years ago. You see, they theorized that they could eat the biggest potatoes and use the smaller ones for seed. Consequently, what they did was they ate all the big potatoes and they planted the small potatoes. As a result of this practice over the years, nature eventually reduced the size of all the potatoes they harvested to the size of marbles. And they gained a new insight and a new understanding on what was going on. Through this bitter experience, they learned that they could not always have the best things of life just for themselves and then use just simply the leftovers. They needed to plant sometimes the best things in the ground. They needed to use some of that abundance and give back in order for the soil to keep giving to them. And we shouldn't and we cannot take away all that we want and store everything that we think we want. The world is not built so that we can have the most. We are called to live a life where we look after our creation and share that abundance and plant back in so that the land keeps giving. What we sow in life is important because the only way to reap the benefits of God's blessing is to live in obedience to His voice and to the kind of people that He has called us to be. We've given lots this morning. I'm sure that many of you have given lots to go to our food banks, and that's one brilliant way of being God's people. But this year, let's not end our harvest thinking just with this one service in the church. One of the challenges of the time is that we need to look at the way in which we are caring for the world that provides food in the first place. We need to reconnect with the world that we have been gifted, a place that can provide abundance for all. We need to be a people who are mindful of the harvest, not just on 1 or 2 Sundays a year, but the whole year the whole year around. We need to think how, as a church, we begin to contribute in the battle against climate change. For surely, if we want to reap the blessings of God, then we need to sow the seeds of obedience. We need to listen to His voice and be the people He has called us to be. And if we can learn that, then what a harvest this world will have. Amen.